I'm going to date myself here a little bit, but one of my favorite all-time movies is from 1987. It stars Sean Connery and Kevin Costner. It's a movie called The Untouchables, and it's about the mob, specifically about Al Capone, and Elliot Ness, an FBI agent played by Kevin Costner, is really struggling to make some progress and to see change come into his community. And he's asked by Sean Connery, Detective Malone, a question that still to this day rattles me. And the question is this: he asked him, what is it that you are prepared to do? What are you prepared to do? Today we're starting to study in Nehemiah. And Nehemiah is a book full of adventure. It's full of scandal, betrayal. It's full of sacrifice, all the great themes that we love in story. And yet at the heart of it, underlining the entire book, is the same question that we have to ask ourselves even today. When we're faced with challenges, when we're faced with things in life, we're asked this question: what are you prepared to do? What am I prepared to do? What are we prepared to do? You know, story leads to story. It's one of the reasons we love books, movies, music. They invite us to dream. They invite us to dare to ask difficult questions of ourselves, of people we love. We love story, we're drawn to it. And here in Nehemiah in chapter 1, we're introduced to the main character of our study, Nehemiah himself, the hero of this entire book. And as we're invited into his presence, I can't help but be drawn back to another story, the story of William Wallace in Braveheart. William Wallace was a lot like Nehemiah, or Nehemiah was a lot like him, in that they both had tragedy take place in their lives. They both had brokenness. They were surrounded by circumstances that caused them to doubt if there was any hope. They were in despair. They had difficulties in their life. And in the midst of all of that, in our story of William Wallace, he, encountering that brokenness, decides he's going to do something about it. And he builds an army of men around him. He inspires them, he motivates them, and he asks them a powerful question. He asks them this question: what will you do without freedom? And you might remember his famous line if you've seen that movie. If not, you should watch it. But where he's constantly yelling freedom, riding back and forth in front of his man on his horse. And that's Nehemiah as well. Nehemiah motivates us to ask hard questions through his story and through his life. As we pick up the story of Nehemiah in chapter 1 here, Nehemiah is a captive in the kingdom of Persia. He's serving the king, and he is working like most slaves do in another kingdom that is not his home. Israel has been destroyed for years now, taken captive by Babylon, and since then conquered by Persia. And so here is Nehemiah in the middle of another kingdom, in the middle of tragedy, away from home. And we're going to pick up our story with Nehemiah in verse number 3 of chapter 1, where Nehemiah does this. He asked a friend of his, Hananiah, and his brother about Jerusalem. And this is important because for the Jewish nation, Jerusalem was the capital of God. It's where God was worshipped. It's where his reputation, his character dwelled there in his presence in the temple. And it had very significant meaning to the Jewish people. It was the center of everything. So here's Nehemiah in Persia working. He sees a friend of his and his brother, and he asks him this question in verse 3 about what is going on with his beloved city, Jerusalem. And he's told this: the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. You know, shame is the reminder of our guilt, our failure. We all hate shame, we all hate guilt, but we're all very familiar with it, and we know what it's like to live in it. At some time in our life, we've been saturated by it. And I know that's true because from the very beginning with Adam and Eve, that's been Satan's goal, to get us to live in shame, live in embarrassment of the choices and the decisions that we've made. And that's his goal today, for that to be our identity. Because if we're living in shame and guilt, we're not going to be attempting great things for God. We're not going to ask those hard questions. We're going to live paralyzed by those concepts. So Jerusalem found itself in a state of shame, and it's literally a translation of the state of the people as well. They were also living in a state of shame. And what we discover hearing this news did for Nehemiah is heartbreaking, and I think it draws us into the story deeper and causes us to relate to what Nehemiah experienced when he heard that news. And it brings us to verse number 4. So we get down to verse 4, and Nehemiah responds in a way I think we do and would. he begins to weep. He begins to mourn in the midst of that brokenness, that devastation of not only what's happened to his people, but what's happened to God, whom he loves and adores. And in that mourning, weeping brokenness, it leads him into prayer, which is what a big chunk of this chapter is about. It's his prayer of confession for where he is and where God's people are. And so he prays and he fasts. And I think it's interesting to point out that he takes action here. He doesn't just sit and stay contented in the brokenness, which is easy for us all to do, but he takes spiritual action. He begins to practice spiritual disciplines of prayer and fasting, saying, okay, I'm not just going to respond emotionally. I want to respond the way God wants me to respond. So he sits in that for days, seeking God's voice, seeking God's will, seeking God's response to what do I do out of this? I see the need. I'm broken because of the need, but what is it you want me to do? What is it you want me to do? And so out of this prayer of confession, we get down to verse 9. And verse 9 tells us this: if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though your outcasts are in the uttermost parts of heaven, from there I will gather you and bring them to my place I have chosen to make my name dwell there. So verse 9 is packed full of all types of information. At this point in time, God is doing the speaking in this prayer, and he's saying, if you'll let me, it's the promise that God made that Nehemiah is holding him to. If you'll let me, I'll bring you back. Because right now the Jews are scattered all over the place. There's different nations that have them in slavery due to God's judgment against them that's been taking place for decades and decades and decades. And so they're scattered, but Nehemiah is saying, God, don't forget what you promised. You're going to make everything right. You're going to bring everything back to the way it's supposed to be. You're going to bring your people back to your nation, your land, to Jerusalem. And this is a good point for us to take notice of, because Nehemiah here at the root of it all, he's talking about restoration. Restoration is that thing we have longed for since the beginning. Restoration reminds us that as we look around at the brokenness in our own world and our own communities, that things aren't the way they should be. And there's a part of all of us deep in our own hearts, like Nehemiah, that breaks, that weeps, that mourns, that pleads with God to say, hey, could you please make things right? Could you please restore things to the way they're supposed to be? And that's what Nehemiah is doing here. Out of this confession, out of his weeping and mourning, his prayer and fasting, he's saying, God, don't forget, you're the one who promised to restore. And in that promise, we're reminded that God is faithful. God will do what God says he's going to do. And there's great hope in that. That's why we don't see Nehemiah remaining in despair, remaining in just a very broken state, which is easy to live in. He comes back to what we cling to, hope, that God promised he will restore everything, and he will do it when he's ready. But the best part is he invites us to be a part of that restoration, which brings us to verse 11, and one of the most fascinating phrases, I think, in the whole chapter, and maybe the whole book. The last sentence in verse 11 says this, Nehemiah talking, he says, now I was cupbearer to the king. Such a simple phrase, but yet full of information for us. Basically, Nehemiah is pointing out, I'm nothing more than just a butler, somebody that brings the king his wine. And the reason that's important is when we look at things around us that God invites us to get involved in, we often think, I'm not qualified for that. I'm not good enough. What can I do? I'm not in a position of power or influence. So we don't dare to dream. We don't dare to ask hard questions of ourselves. We don't dare to enter brokenness and try to make a difference because we think, I'm not good enough. I'm not qualified enough. And Nehemiah, I think by God's inspiration, intentionally points out to us that he was nothing more than just a cupbearer. Because when it comes to God, qualifications don't matter. God's looking for people that are broken, people that are sold out, loyal, loving him with all their heart, that are willing to ask hard questions. Questions like, what am I prepared to do about the stuff I see going on around me? Our heart's desire for you is that you have deep conversations out of this, that things change because of this. We hope that we've said something that's triggered a question in your life and in your group that you guys can talk about. If it hasn't triggered anything specific and you're not really sure where to go, we have some extra questions we've provided for you that hopefully will take you and your group to deeper places if you desire to do that. But more than anything else, just talk, have a conversation, get connected deeper with each other in these spiritual truths, and ask yourselves these questions. Ultimately, what are we prepared to do about the community God has placed us in?